Hello and welcome to the 2022 Boston College Arts Festival. I'm the Visual Arts Coordinator, Yifan Wang.
And I'm the Visual Arts Coordinator Assistant, Megan Cassidy.
And now you're listening to the Artist Podcast series presented by the Boston College Arts Council Office.
Good, how are you?
I'm good. So good to see you here again.
Definitely, I'm excited. Yeah.
Me too. I can't believe it's already been a year. Thank you for doing this with us again this year.
No, definitely, yeah.
Wow. How's everything going?
It's been going great. Yeah, I've had a lot of fun and I'm trying to do some different things this year too.
Yeah, like photography wise or just art in general?
A little bit of both. I've been experimenting with different things, which is why even the piece that I submitted this year is a little bit different than what I did.
Yeah. Speaking of that, let's start with the piece. You submitted a gigantic file with
Yeah.
the photography. Let's start with that. Where did you take that and where behind it?
Yeah, definitely. So that picture is the amalgamation of maybe 8 or 9 different pictures together. So it was inspired by the work of Andreas Gursky, who was a photographer in the early 90s, early 2000s, sort of around the turn and the birth of the new Photoshop age in photography. And this year we wanted to do a lot of different things while working with my professor Greer Maldoni and trying to push my artistic style and trying to experiment with different things. So I got really inspired by a lot of his work. So I said, let me see if I can get as close to it as possible and try to sort of mimic some of the ideas and some of the tools that he used and sort of push my own skills in Photoshop a little bit. So I think that was at a parking garage somewhere in the North End, just gathering different images and then going to work in Photoshop and pulling them all together. So it was really interesting, because it was a lot of time on the back end, which I'm sort of not used to. I'll do a lot of my stuff in camera, which is a lot of fun. And I like to make sure I can, if I am staging or gathering an image, whatever, for it to be finished, I really make sure at least I used to try to do a lot of it in camera. This semester I wanted to try to sort of push myself with my sort of my photographic skills and the back end stuff, which is why I wanted to really push and try to mimic, but also just experiment with the ideas that Gursky really pulls together.
Interesting. When I first saw this photograph, I didn't realize it was photoshopped together. Could you elaborate more on that? Is this
No, definitely.
You took it at the same spot and then you overlap them together?
Definitely. So that's a little bit of the magic, right? Gursky himself did a lot, especially when he first started messing around with Photoshop with a lot of his pieces, to make sure that a lot of his edits were seamless. So there's a lot of times when you look at some of his work where he might have a chain of islands pulled together and it might be an amalgamation of 20 different photos and you can't really tell. So the goal for me with this piece was to try to see how far I could push the idea and to sort of rearrange some new topic of my own design and sort of pull things together. So there's a lot of different things where some of the cars are from different places, some of the people that are on the sidewalk are from different places. I did my best to really try to make sure that things were a little bit seamless, a little bit blendless. You couldn't really tell what was what was a part of the original image, what wasn't supposed to be there, what was there, to really sort of pull that image together and things like that.
Interesting. It's when you do this, is it either you or the artist you get inspiration from? Is it meant to be a discrete move that you meant it to be seamless, where you want people to actually realize later, oh, this is Photoshop, or just curious about that?
I think for me, at least, that's where I tried to differ. So a lot of what we did this year with this project was taking what we learned from the original artist and trying to putting our own spin on it, right? So a lot of the ideas that I wanted to talk about in this were sort of a little bit about consumerism, a little bit about, mass production and how we work through everyday life and sort of just the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Now, sometimes a lot of things happen that you don't always pay attention to. So what would it look like if you had a top-down view of that world, try to see if things were happening so quickly, what is actually real, what actually isn't, because there's so much that happens around us that we just don't pay attention to.
Interesting. I love the way you describe it, because for me, when you said it's Photoshopped, I realized it is a collapse of different time and the same space, but not the exact same space. So it's you shrink the time and then you put them on the same space, and it's like a time travel, or like a different sort of time travel. So it's very interesting too. And also like the way you describe it about from a top down view, look at the world, like especially traffic. Sometimes they're just there and then they slip through, and even like passersby you run into on the street randomly. This is very interesting. Is this like a topic they've been exploring, like time and space in photography?
Yeah, in some ways, I've come up and I've worked on a couple of different projects this year, and this was sort of like the start of that journey.
Mm,
My experience with time and like my relativity to that and my own experience is something I've been really looking into. So a lot of my other projects have had to do with time in some way or shape or form.
mm,
Like another project I worked on this year was like a project that I did on my dad, and like how I've experienced my relationship with him as I've grown up over time. So like trying to compress my experiences with him through like photos that I had, found photos, or even just new photos I've taken of him. So like
very
it all sort of started with this first project.
Very interesting. In my art history class, we were talking about this with a professor. One of the reading we did was also talking about the relationship between modern photography and abstract painting. And it's sort of, there's this similarity between them. And for photography, you capture the instance of that moment. And it's like a 100% representation of that moment, because it's a photography and not like painting or other materials. But this is very interesting. But then with the evolution of Photoshop, it also gives photography a different tool and different meanings to it. And I think after explaining it, a collage of different time adds a different layer to it. Wow, this is very interesting. Do you have other, I mean, this is the only one you submitted, but do you have other photographs using the similar technique with just different themes, or are there the street scene or like traffic or like this transient moment in life?
Definitely. There were a couple other that I experimented with when I was first sort of coming up with the idea. One of which was sort of like the idea of like looking at like theater lights above like a show theater.
Mm,
Like the large like bulb lights that hang above the entrance to a theater, and like sort of the idea of duplicating those and replicating them into infinity. A lot of Gursky's pieces and a lot of the work that I wanted to try to play with or just pull ideas from plays on the boundary of, like I spoke to earlier, like the idea of this is a real moment. This could exist, but the longer you look at it, the more you think about it, it's just you start to realize how strange or just a little bit abstract or how like unnatural the moment might be. And I think that even for the piece that I submitted this year, like, you know, is this your toy car or whatever I called it? I think I danced that line pretty closely because like it looks like it could be an actual traffic scene. Like, wow, there's all these cars around, there's all these people hustling and bustling. But like digging into the nitty and gritty, like if somebody was from the north end, they would know that area isn't super busy. You know, like there's not a lot of traffic going on. You would learn that like, so I think that I like the idea that for anyone, regardless of where you're from, if you're a local to the area, it has a different context for you because you can realize the richness of how like, oh, this might not be an actual scene because that street is so narrow. There's not a lot going on. So I'm playing with perspective and time. And for somebody who doesn't really have the same context, you can just look at this scene and you're like, wow, there's just so much going on. And then the more you read about it, the more you hear me talk about it, you're like, wow, I can't really tell, you know, and I love that response. People like, I can't tell what was the original photo, what wasn't, like, and people pulling that apart to like really get into the photo to try to figure that out.
Right.
And I love that experience that really engages the audience with the piece.
Wow, very interesting. Yeah, I would, if it didn't tell me, I wouldn't realize this is several photographs. I saw this piece in person in Dublin. Is there a choice you made in terms of scale, because it's very big, the actual photographs?
So the history of Andreas Gursky, like all of his pieces are massive. Even the one that you saw, like his pieces tend to be twice the size, right? So even with me, like I was working with the limitations of new tools that I had. So like that year we had a new line of like roll paper that we were using down in the lab itself. So I really wanted to push sort of how big I could go with the idea. You know, between the quality of the images as well as just like trying to get close to what he did, but sort of doing it in my own style.
Mhm.
So I didn't want to take up an entire wall with just
No.
one photo, but I wanted to sort of approach that idea. Um, and that also has to do with some of the graininess or like the grit to the photos themselves. I sort of just give you this effect that like you can tell it's a very real image, but some of that haziness sort of gives it the illusion like, oh, this might be actually real because it's just a little bit out of focus. You can't see all of the detail, but you can see enough that it still feels very sharp and clear. And messing with some of those different things, in Photoshop to really give it that illusion that like, oh yeah, this was just Friday night or something like that. And there's a bunch of traffic going on. And like, what does that really mean if it isn't a real image? And like, how do we interpret that?
Very interesting. One last question. Is these, you have different colors of cars. Are these also by choice? Or they're just, I don't want to say random because apparently everything is carefully planned in this composition, but I'm just curious about the colors. Are these also by choice?
Sometimes and a lot of times as photographers, the gift that we have is to be able to go out and experience a moment, right? And to try to do different things. So when I went out, there was some sort of like loose formality idea in my head of like, oh, I would love to be able to try to find different types of cars, different types of photos, like just some of the looser ideas. And then, you get the little Easter eggs that come from just actually going out there and doing it. So like that big red car in the middle was one of those Easter eggs. Like it just happened to drive by. I was like, this is perfect. Like, I have to take this. Honestly, like surprisingly, like there were a lot of cars that were just kind of like the same color, the same shape, the same size. Even when I really went back into editing, I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. I didn't expect that myself. And like that kind of played into how much I sort of edited or manipulated the photo myself. Because I was wondering if I should really go or push the idea that like maybe like, hey, if I'm looking at traffic, nobody pays attention to like how many black cars sometimes or like how many white cars. So like it makes it really easy to just, even if you saw the exact same car 2 or 3 times, you may not always connect those dots. So like trying to really pull some of those different things together. So I guess to answer your question and not answer your question, it was definitely intentional with certain things. I got blessed to see certain cars come by, but other times it was just sort of like just amassing whatever I got as a photo.
Yeah.
And sort of using that to my advantage.
Very interesting. And also, I think what you said about consumerism in the beginning too. I was like, this also ties back to how consumers make choice and also, like the color you choose for a car speaks about your personality too.
Totally.
So it's very interesting how individual has different choice within the big consumerism world. And speaking of that, also with the recent shortage on chips and stuff, we have like this crazy rise in price in cars and like even secondhand cars or like just new cars. So I found it also very interesting if you look at in present day context and see this connection between consumerism and the subject of your piece, the traffic and the cars. Very interesting. And there any last thing that I missed or you want to tell the audience about?
If anything, if people do go see the piece, I encourage you, yes, where's Waldo? Try to figure out what you can. If you know what's real, what's not, get close, step back. If anything, I encourage people to get as far away from it and look at it, because then that really plays with the allure of what I'm really dealing with in the image. But at the end of the day, like one of the larger ideas like I talked about was a little bit of the consumerism, but also just like you said, like in forms of individuality, right? A lot of times people will go to get a car and they'll be like, yeah, I want this black one. And like, it's really, it very much is a statement piece for who they are. But then when you get a chance to like get a different perspective about that choice, you realize that there aren't really that many different things that separate us. We have 16 different black cars, 10 different white ones. And it's like, at the end of the day, like, if you really get a little bit of distance away from it, like a car is a car. Like there's not really too much besides the brand that separates it. So it's like playing with some of those ideas about conformity, consumerism, like sense of identity and like how we try to represent those things. And sometimes like how perspective can change how we even try to represent ourselves. But yeah.
Very, very nicely said. And wow, it's almost really like doing a philosophical attack on like free will. Oh my God. Yeah. Very interesting. Alrighty. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing all these wonderful ideas with us.
Definitely. Thank you. I'm looking forward
Thank
to it as
you.
well.